generally, the faster a vehicle goes, the more of a problem that is going to show up. If you have a front end issue, loose bearing or something like that, you might be fine driving around town, but you get out on the highway and you'll really start to vibrate. Hopefully you can see, as I'm driving along here, there's no problem at all. What I want to illustrate is that the vibration that occurs in this vehicle is when we're braking. So even if I take my hand just like that, you can see that the vehicle is driving nice and steady. And as I said, like most other problems, the faster you go, the more apparent the issue becomes. So I'm on the highway, coming off a ramp. I'm going to slow down. You can actually hear it. It's vibrating that bad when I hit the brakes. Going to make a video today on replacing brake rotors. The problem here is when I drive the vehicle, I'm out on the highway, everything is great, there's no vibration. As soon as I start to slow the vehicle down, hit the brakes, I get a really strong vibration, and the vibration stops when I release the brakes. So the most common problem that causes that is warped brake rotors. So the first thing we want to do is loosen the wheel lug nuts about half a turn or so while the weight of the vehicle is still on the ground. So go around each lug nut, loosen them off, as I say, about half a turn or so, going counterclockwise, lefty-loosey. So now I got the vehicle jacked up off the ground. I'm working on the front brakes here, so the emergency brake is on. I have some blocks behind the wheels just to make sure that absolutely nothing can happen as far as the vehicle moving. Got my trusty manual. If you got one of these, great to reference, read over the section for your particular vehicle on how to do this. Got my blocks ready over here. I'm going to safely support this vehicle. So that's what you want to be concerned about, is making sure that the vehicle is stabilized and safely supported. Anyway, at this point I'm going to take the wheel off and we'll be able to access the brake rotors. To do this procedure, we are going to be retracting the brake pads into the caliper, and when we do that and force those pads away from the brake rotor so that the new rotor can go in, we're going to be forcing the brake fluid back into the master cylinder. So find the master cylinder for your vehicle, remove the cap off it, and that will allow the pressure to be released, so you're not forcing too much pressure back into the master cylinder. Check the level in there. If it's high, you can take a turkey baster and just suck some of the fluid back out, and then after the procedure just put the brake fluid back in to get it full again. Once you have the tire and rim removed, you got access to your brake rotor. A couple of different scenarios you may have. As I say, read over your manual you have for your vehicle. That way you don't know exactly what you're going to be dealing with. Some rotors are going to have a screw like this that has to be released. So what we're going to do is take an impact driver and release this. This is probably going to be tight because there's so much heat around brakes when they're engaged that any parts usually become seized up, and they're usually pretty difficult to get off. So we're going to use an impact driver to release this. If you need any more details on it, I actually have a video how to use an impact driver you can get some more details there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go over, put a C-clamp, you'll see it in a minute when we do it, and release these brake pads. Now, as I say, depending on what type of vehicle you have, sometimes there's different types of calipers that some will have like a screw-on type device. Then there's a little tool, I think costs about $15 to engage that, and it'll actually turn and screw the caliper in or out. And of course, you want to use your vehicle jack stands or big sturdy safety blocks. Make sure everything is up good and safe. And then I'm going to spray it down with some brake cleaner, because brake dust is toxic. So, get safety glasses, a mask to keep the dust out of your lungs, and use some brake cleaner. Now, we could go and retract the brake pads into the caliper and remove the caliper, but I like to do this part first, just so I'm going to know if I'm going to run into any issues with these rotor screws being seized up. So, impact driver in the rotor screw there. Be careful doing this, don't hit your hand like I just did. And hopefully you can see that. That's the idea there. These impact drivers, great tools. I think this is like probably about $25. Not really expensive. So now we want to do the part about retracting the brake pads into the caliper. So take a C-clamp, place it on the pads, and then you're going to go back to the rear of the caliper and place the clamp in there, being careful not to lay it on your brake flex line or anything like that. You want it on the hard steel of the caliper. And once that's in place, start to tighten it up. I got a little cheater bar on the front of it here, just to make it a little easier to turn. And I'm just going to see if I can show you hold this camera and show those pads actually retracting in here. I don't know if that's going to show up or not. So I'm turning it now. May not be able to pick that up on the camera. Actually you can. I think if you look there, you can see that the pads are actually moved in away from the caliper. And sometimes when you're working around the brakes, you don't have to retract them all the way in, but in this case you want to, because a new thicker rotor is going in there. So there you can see where the C-clamp has moved those pads in, and you don't want to get too aggressive with it, but I'll show you that again. But you want to turn that so that you retracted them all the way in, which they are now. Next, you want to loosen off your caliper mounting bolts. I actually had to turn the wheel a little bit. Turned out that I couldn't access those bolts because my safety block was in the way. So just be careful doing that. As long as everything is supported and everything, you may be able to turn turn your wheel to access things. So in this case, it's a 17 millimeter mounting bolt. I've loosened it off. Turn it here so you can see a little bit easier. So that's the top caliper mounting bolt there. And I left my socket on down below, so hopefully you can see the proximity of the lower one. There it is. So I'm going to remove those and we'll set the caliper aside. Once you have the caliper removed, take it tie wrap it or tie something around it in such a way as that it's not just hanging on its own weight there, because that caliper is pretty heavy and you don't want it putting undue stress on the brake flex hose in behind here. In my experience, it's very rare that these rotors actually just pull off, simply because of the heat they're subject to with braking. So try something first and then I'll show you plan B. I'm actually kind of hoping this doesn't release in this case, because I want to show you a method of releasing for rotors like this that actually have these screw holes here. But the first thing I usually do is give them a good hammer in between the nuts there, see if it'll release the rotor from the hub. And I can't do that right now because my camera's in the way. So that's typical. The one time that I was kind of hoping that it wouldn't release by hammering in between here, it did. But basically what I was going to show was that, maybe I will still show it too, if you reference your manual, your Haynes manual or your Chilton manual, it'll give you a size of a bolt that you can screw into here if you got the type of rotor that's got these screws like we released before. And we'll thread one in here a bit and thread one in here and keep going side to side, tightening them up, and it's hitting against the hub in behind here, and it'll actually release the rotor right off there, forcing it away from the steering knuckle. Well, I was going to thread those bolts in for demonstration purposes, but I couldn't find the size of the bolts that I needed anyway. I know I have them, but who knows where they're at. Anyway, as I say, if you need that size, it'll be given in the vehicle manual. Chilton, Haynes, whatever it is you get. Anyway, in this case, I'll go for a little manual persuasion. You get the idea. And if I didn't mention it before, you definitely want to have safety glasses on doing this too. Banging old rusty parts, little pieces going everywhere. Anyway, once you take your rotor off, you'll see something along these lines. Got a bearing inside here, there's the hub and the steering knuckle. We're ready to clean this up a bit and put the new rotor on. So, line up the rotor screw holes on the new rotor with the hole in the hub in behind here, see by my finger there, and just place the new rotor on there. Then, as I say again, in the case of rotors that have these screws, put those screws back on. I'll tighten that up with my driver. Now that the new rotor's in place, release your caliper from however it was that you tied it up there, and we can put our caliper mounting bolts back in. Just kind of move your caliper around a little bit, jiggle it. I find it's easier, and then it'll start to the bolt will start to thread in. Matter of preference, you can do the bottom first, top first. I tend to like to do the top. Anyways, get those caliper mounting bolts in there, and then torque them up, tighten them up to the torque that the manual recommends. At this point, I have the caliper back in place. The manual, in the case of this vehicle, recommended 80 foot-pounds, so I torqued both of the bolts to that setting. I would tighten the top a bit, then I go to the bottom a bit, and then go back and forth so that I didn't get one really tight and then tighten the other. So that is back in place. Earlier in the video I actually turned the wheel so that I would have access to the caliper mounting bolts. So now I'm going to turn that back, straighten the wheel up here, and put the tire and rim back on. Once you get your tire and rim back on, I just tighten them up so that they're nice and snug. The vehicle is jacked now. I've removed my safety blocking, and I'm going to put the jack, release the jack, and get the weight of the vehicle back on to the tire here. So I'll just get them just snug, and then once I release the jack and put the weight of the vehicle back on, I'll go around and tighten them up really good to the torque setting that's in the vehicle, just because I don't like to put too much strain on these when the drive shaft and everything is going to put a lot of pressure on the drive shaft if you tighten those up. Anyway, that's how I do it. I'll release the jack and tighten them up more. A couple other items I just want to quickly mention too. Right now I'm overdoing the brake rotor on the passenger side. The earlier part of the video was the rotor on the driver's side. There's no sense in changing just one rotor. If one of them is warped or worn, they probably both are, so you want to change both rotors. Another issue is they recommend in the manuals to spray the rotor with a solvent to remove the protective coating over the rotor. Once both rotors are replaced, get in the vehicle, give the brake some slow, steady pumps to regain pressure on the braking system, and I can feel that coming back now. And what's happening is as we pump the brake, it's putting the fluid pressure through the braking system and pushing those brake pads back onto the rotors, because we had forced them away from the rotors with the C-clamp. Now that you've put pressure back into the braking system, check the brake fluid level in the master cylinder and top that back up to the full level. And once you top the master cylinder back up with brake fluid, give those brakes another couple of pumps just to verify it. Then hold your foot down on the brake pedal, start the vehicle. Your foot will go down a little bit more as the power brakes kick in. Make sure that you got the proper amount of pressure on the system, and then take the vehicle, if you're confident that you have good pressure back into the braking system, take it for a slow test drive. Pump your brakes a couple times after you start the vehicle. I would start mine and do it, only I'm not sure if you'd be able to hear me. But yeah, start the vehicle, give it a couple of pumps, and then go for a slow test drive and use the brakes a couple times to verify everything is okay. So I did as I mentioned. I took my vehicle out on my street, very low traffic area. Drove it a little ways, hit the brakes very gently, kind of made sure that the brakes pads were all seated in, and now I'm out on the highway. So I know that the rotors were the problem. I drove the vehicle through town since replacing the rotors, and there's no vibration anymore when I come to a stop, even just at lower speeds coming, as I say, driving through town. But coming off the highway here, I just want to show that as I hit the brakes, I'm going to hit the brake good and solid. You should see that there's no vibration in the wheel anymore. There. So that's problem is fixed, and that's the symptom and the problem of warped rotors.